I'm not sure, but I may have accidentally just taken a sleeping pill.
Maybe, I'm not sure, but I may have just accidentally eaten a whale. I don't know. It's possible.
So is this the part of the show where you go over the rules of etiquette and good behavior with guests?
No, this is the part of the show where we get it all out of our system so that we can behave like adults.
Wait, it's taken you 145 episodes to behave like adults? Wait a minute.
It's going to take a lot more than that. A lot more.
Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This podcast is sponsored by New Relic. To track and optimize your application's performance, go to rubyrogues.com/New Relic. This episode is sponsored by CodeClimate. CodeClimate automated code reviews ensure that your projects stay on track. Fix and find quality and security issues in your Ruby code sooner. Try it free at rubyrogues.com/CodeClimate. Does your application need to send emails? Did you know that 20% of all email doesn't even get delivered to the inbox? SendGrid can help you get your message delivered every time. Go to rubyrogues.com/SendGrid, sign up for free, and tell them thanks.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 146 of the Ruby Rogues podcast. Chuck is out today, so I'll be your host, and with me today is Josh Susser.
Hello from San Francisco.
Afti Graham.
Hello from Pennsylvania.
Ruby Rogues alum Aaron Patterson.
Hello from the internet.
And with us today is special guest Pat Shaughnessy.
Hi, it's Pat. Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome to the show, Pat.
Yeah. Since this is your first time on, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm Pat Shaughnessy. I'm a Ruby developer. I worked for a long time at McKinsey, which is a management consulting firm. And now I'm doing some freelancing, and I live outside of Boston in Massachusetts.
And we asked Pat on the show today to talk about typos. No, not typos.
I don't know anything about typos.
We asked Pat on to talk about his book, Ruby Under the Microscope, which we've all been reading. It's very good.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate, again, having me on. Thanks a lot. And also, thanks for reading the book. It's a lot to take, so I'm sure it wasn't easy.
I had a lot of fun with the book. So, Pat, I used to do virtual machine development. I did Smalltalk and Java stuff. And yeah, so this was great. This was like a lot of information that I've sort of suspected was what was going on in Ruby and some of the stuff I'd learned in various places. But this put it all together in one place and fleshed out all the details, and a lot of it felt like familiar territory, but a lot of it was also, ooh, wow. I love the explanations. I thought it was, as a VM implementer, I thought this was a really solid book.
Yeah, this was the most fun I've had reading a tech book in a long time.
Thanks. Thanks, Abdi. Thank you.
So yeah, we all seem to be in agreement, but let's actually start with, what is this book? Why, it's very different, right, from a lot of the tech books we read. Why don't, Pat, you give us the 10,000 foot view?
What the heck is this? Yeah, so, there's a lot of great books out there on programming, especially with Ruby. There's a lot of fantastic Ruby books. And, most books are, programming 101. Like, how do I learn this language? How do I learn Ruby? And that makes a lot of sense. If you're a developer and you want to learn a new language, that's usually why you buy a programming book, right? So I wanted to do something different. And I've always been interested in Ruby internals and how things work on the inside. And I'll talk a lot more about that later if we have time, but I just figured it would be really fun to write sort of more advanced book about how Ruby actually works. And I'd written a few blog articles about that stuff back in 2012, and they seem to be pretty popular, so I figured, there's some appetite for this. And I just think it's an amazing story, so I think whether it's a blog post or a conference presentation or a book, I think it's all about storytelling, right? You want to entertain people. And I think what's going on inside of Ruby for me is just this really interesting story that I wanted to tell. And, the Ruby core team, and I'm glad you're with us today, Aaron. Thanks for coming. You guys have done a lot of amazing work. There's a lot of really amazing things going on inside of the language that we all know and love. And I just wanted to share that with the world, as well as find out for myself. I didn't know any of this stuff before I tried to write the book. So it was great for me to learn it too.
I have to mention, I was the technical reviewer for this book, so if there's any typos, it's my fault.
Yeah, I'm blaming you, Aaron.
as usual. So Pat, I gotta say, the thing that I loved most about this book wasn't just that you presented all the information, but that the entire book was a guide to how to experiment to discover all of this information for yourself. How to learn all of this stuff yourself. So it was like reading the book every time I got to a section that said, oh, here's this question that we want to answer. And then it was, well, here's how we'll create an experiment and we can run some Ruby code to learn something about what's going on inside the VM. Right. And then we can go look at some code or something inside the VM to confirm what we were thinking.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And I think that's one of or maybe the best thing about open source software is you can do that. It's all out there, and, I think back, I've been doing development for like 20 years. I think back to the 90s when I was doing, Microsoft sort of Windows GUI apps. And there was this wall, you couldn't get around it. And, what's going on inside of Windows and what's going on inside of Visual C++? Who knows? They know at Microsoft, but no one else knows. I think that's one of the great things about Ruby or any open source framework is that you can find out. You can just go look at the code yourself. And whether it's Linux, Ruby, or Rails or anything, you can just go read the code and figure it out. And yeah, that's really what this is all about, was figuring out how Ruby works. And then I wanted to also, the other big goal was explain it in a way to people that wasn't intimidating, that made sense, that, made sense to Ruby developers and not just to C developers. If you're not sure if you want to read the book or if you're afraid it's a little too advanced or technical, I really try to explain things so that if you're a Ruby developer, it'll make sense. You don't need to know sort of all the bits and bytes and, assembly language and C programming, all the real technical stuff at a detailed level. So I hope that came across. I hope most Ruby developers were able to follow along.
It definitely did. I got to agree with Josh. I got sucked into the experiments. At one point, you're showing the difference between for and each, and you just did it to show that under the hood, for is just a syntactic trick, and it's actually calling each. But what's actually always bugged me about for and each in Ruby is the way it leaks a variable in the outer scope when you switch to for. And so I took that example you started and played around with it so that I could see the instructions in YARV. And like Ruby actually takes this extra step to assign that variable up to that outer scope. And I'm like, why do you do that? Because that's the variable leak that I always can't stand about the for loop. So it was cool to get sucked into that and be able to play with the examples and see what was happening.
Does anyone even use for loops now?
Well, I used to see them all the time in Rails code. They used to be a fashion in Rails code for some reason. Nowadays, I don't think I see them.
Well, okay, in Rails back in the 1.0 days, it was like use each in the model or in the controller and for in the view.
Yeah.
Was that
you remember that?
Yeah.
And why was this a thing exactly?
I have seen it suggested that for was somehow looked better in views, or that maybe the people that are making the views would be more familiar with the for concept. But I've never found that terribly convincing. I think each works just as well in a view. I agree. And logicless views work even better.
What?
You're not making any sense. You're being illogical.
That's a whole nother episode.
I have a question about the book.
All right, you get one question, Aaron.
How were you able to fit Ruby under a microscope?
It's a great question. It's a really good one.
Well, Aaron, Ruby's come in all shapes and sizes. I got a smaller one that fit.
I thought I got a pre-release version of MRuby because it can fit on really small.
Ruby because it's smaller.
Okay, now we're going to get even more feedback about how lame our humor is.
Oh no, it's just me. That's why you bring me on as a guest to make the humor even worse. It's okay.
It's awesome.
I knew this was a bad idea. No, and again, thanks for coming, Aaron. I just wanted to. I wanted you to answer all the tough questions today. I wanted you to be humorous, but really, I just wanted to thank you for all the help that you gave me on the book and for fixing all my mistakes. And not only that, you gave me just a lot of great suggestions for maybe what was missing or what else, just what else I could put in. So I really, really appreciate it. And, I think
no problem at all. I'm glad I was able to review the book. I actually enjoyed reading it a lot. The reason I liked it is because it's very, it discusses Ruby internals, but it does it in a really approachable way. I liked it a lot because I don't think we have a lot of advanced books. There aren't very many, and this is an advanced book, but you don't have to be a C programmer, but if you are a C programmer, you can actually dive into the source and be like, oh, okay, I can handle that. So I really enjoyed reading it.
Thanks, and I think that's important because I think people should know. Like one of the reasons I wrote this book is I think Ruby developers should know how their language works. The way I look at it is Ruby is like the tool that we use to solve problems, and for me, the best way to know how to use a tool is to sort of know what the tool is doing. How does the tool itself work? What's going on inside the tool? And the same thing could be said for Rails or for any software framework, Angular or whatever. If you really want to be good at using Active Record, if you really want to know what to do and what not to do with Active Record, you sort of have to, at some point, dive in and learn the code inside of Rails. How does Active Record actually work? What is it really doing? And I think that's the same for Ruby itself. And the problem is, of course, it's written in a different language. It's really hard to figure out. And so that's what I was trying to do, is just give people that information that maybe they couldn't get anywhere else.
The main problem with that analogy, though, is that nobody actually knows how Active Record works.
Ha ha!
Right.
Ha. You do, Aaron. That's all we need.
Nope.
Pat, you said something in the introduction that goes along with what you were just saying there that I really liked. It said that you could read this book to learn how Ruby's creators intend for you to use it. And that was just a thought I hadn't had before, that when they're creating and designing the language, they have in mind, we hope, intentional usage. How would this be used? And by looking into some of this, we run into that. We see, how are they intending for us to use the language? It's an interesting idea.
Yeah. I think that came to me when because I wrote the introduction sort of at the end, which is kind of a funny thing, but I was imagining, I don't know, that really hit me when I was writing the chapter about blocks and closures and how the stack works and how it finds variables, where you referenced a function or a block. And all that stuff, that sort of stuff, like chapter 8 in the book, when I was figuring that out and writing that, it sort of struck me. There's a lot going on here, and I think Matt's and the core team, when he invented the language, he wanted us to be doing that sort of thing. He wanted us to be using blocks in a certain way and using lambdas and procs and other things in a certain way, and sort of like the way that they work in Lisp. And that's what led me to write that sentence, and that's what I had in mind. But then other things as well. It applies to, modules and objects and classes, all that stuff. They were designed in a certain way to work a certain way. And, so understanding how they work helps us, I think, understand what we should be doing with them.
On that note, something else I've found that's helpful for understanding how it was intended to be used is I've been following the Ruby core mailing list for a while now. And it's just really fascinating to see. Somebody will pop up with an idea for an addition to Ruby, and it's like, oh yeah, that seems like a really neat idea. And then you'll see the conversation that ensues, and somebody will bring up some unforeseen consequences of that idea, and suddenly it's like, oh wow, that would have been a terrible idea. So yeah, it's just another perspective on, the thought that goes into this.
So Pat, I did find a few things that I thought were missing from the book.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to the sequel, Ruby Under an Atomic Force Microscope.
Ruby under an electron microscope.
So in particular, there was no discussion at all about the efficiency of double quoted strings versus single quoted strings.
Good one. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think there's a lot missing, and I don't intend this to be an exhaustive explanation of every single thing that goes on inside of Ruby. In fact, I think to be serious, I think the biggest thing that's missing, and I just, literally ran out of steam, ran out of energy, was a discussion of threading and multi-threading and how that works and how it doesn't work in Ruby, and comparing that to... Especially
with, how fibers now play into all of that, right?
Yeah, and part of it was there's other great books on that. I know Jesse Stormer wrote a book on threading stuff, and I just, I didn't know anything about it, and I just didn't have time and the energy to keep going and keep writing, and so that's one big thing that's missing, and there's other, I think less important stuff missing. So, but what I tried to cover was what I thought was the fundamental core ideas of the language. Starting with, so parsing, how does Ruby understand your code? I think that's really interesting. And how does it work? What's really going on there? Going into the VM and how it works. And then the object model, closures and blocks, all that stuff. So I just picked the things that were most interesting to me, and also, in my opinion, that were the most important, sort of the core identity of Ruby as a language.
Well, I think the things you covered are mainly things you could talk about threading, but I think 80% of the time you're writing stuff that doesn't have to do with threading. Like, you don't particularly care. You're writing stuff in your controllers or, whatever, regular Ruby code, and I think that's what this book covers, is like stuff you need to keep in mind on your daily programming tasks.
Okay.
So I think it's very good.
I like where you're going there, but I've got a one-word response.
Yes.
Refinements.
So I included those. Was that a mistake? Do you think I should have left that out?
I don't know. So that's a good point. Maybe we can talk about this a little. Now, having looked under the hood at how refinements work, and I read the book too, which was good for me because I've not been a fan of refinements, so I was anxious to see how it influenced my opinion on them at all. How do you feel about having refinements in Ruby?
How do I feel about having them in there?
Yes.
I think it sounds like an interesting, cool feature. I don't have a strong opinion about whether it's a good idea or not. I think if it were used responsibly, and maybe that's the key thing here, is most people aren't responsible enough. But if it's used responsibly, why not? It could be really effective and helpful. But like most things in Ruby, if you misuse it or use it too much or do the wrong things with it, it could clearly be very confusing.
Right.
So I guess the big question is, do you have any thoughts on what might constitute a responsible use?
Yeah, as it's intended. I think if you wanted to change the behavior of something in a specific place and not, globally across your app, then I think that could be helpful.
The thing I think that's weird about that is, like, I see where it's going. Like, you want to maybe you want a monkey patch string, but you only want to do it in this class. Whenever I see use cases like that, I'm like, well, why don't you just, like, make a private method in the class
right.
and, like, just call that method and pass a string in? Like, then the other half of me is like, well, I'm just not a huge fan of monkey patching anyway, so am I just biased? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So, reading about the implementation of it, you get to kind of see that it's this special case in Ruby, right? I mean, there has to be a whole separate field in the structure to manage these refinements, And,
yeah, there's a lot of noise in the code, in the C code, a lot of noise about implementing that, right?
Right, and so I have to say that I wasn't really a super big fan going in, and reading about the implementation did not make me a bigger fan. It didn't seem like it was a, super clean thing that just made sense in the existing system. It was more like, to make this work, we're going to have to, wrap a bunch of things around here, and I didn't say that sway me at all. I can definitely understand the point of wanting to be able to, safely change a few things in this context. What extremely worries me about refinements, and I think we have yet to see, a heavy usage of it in the Ruby world, so I'm holding out judgment to see if it can be done right. But my concern is that now that, it applies on basically the module level, what's going to happen is there's some module, influenced by some library, and then because you, put something in that space, somehow in your usage of it, that then you have these inherited behaviors, and there's not a super easy way that I'm aware of for you to see that at, like, the usage level. Like, if you start trying to figure out what method's being called, and you just start calling ancestors or something like that, that's not going to help you.
Yeah,
well, I think there's two answers to that. First, the refinements are lexically scoped. They're supposed to be lexically scoped, so it shouldn't affect you outside of a particular file.
Okay, hang on, I gotta stop you there. That was true in Ruby 2. I do not believe that's true in Ruby 2.1, is it?
Really?
I thought their scope was expanded in Ruby 2.1. Am I wrong?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay,
I'm not sure.
We're gonna try to get a definitive ruling on that, but keep going.
That's what I heard too.
And then the other thing is, if you use the method, you can look up what you're going to call and the source location.
Ah, that's a good point. I did not think of that. So what you're saying is, get a reference to the method, then call source location.
Yeah, and then you know exactly where you're calling.
That's a good point. Yep.
That seems like a lot of work. I can't imagine writing code, like normal kind of code, to do stuff with that amount of metaprogramming in it just to, understand what's going on.
Honestly, I couldn't survive in the Rails code base, working on the Rails code base without the method. I have no idea what's going on right now. I have to use that.
So you mean it as like a debugging tool?
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
Yep,
So that's a different thing.
Does the Rails team, do you guys use refinements?
No.
And would you use them in the future?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly. So the problem is, like, we can't offer... So first off, there's the first most fundamental issue, which is that we support 1.9. So
Right.
we can't use them from that perspective. But even when we drop 1.9, we can't make applications backwards compatible. So, for example, since refinements were lexically scoped in 2.0, we don't know about 2.1. Since they're lexically scoped in 2.0, there's no way that we could turn all of our monkey patches into refinements and then offer them to you in the same place. Because, like, let's say, for example, you're using, I'm trying to think of an active support method, camelize or something like that. If you're using that inside one of your models, since you didn't explicitly require the refinement, then it's not going to work, right? We have to continue to monkey patch in order to be backwards compatible with existing applications. So even if we could use refinements, it's not going to happen for a long time.
A long time, right?
Yeah.
So I just did a little Googling to double check. I've put the link in the show notes, but according to these notes I found, here's what it says about the changes in 2.1. It says that in Ruby 2.1, refinements are no longer experimental and can also be applied within a module without affecting the top-level scope of a file.
Right, I think that sounds right, yeah. In 2.0, I think the compromise was you could only apply or use the refinements in the top-level scope.
So that's the lexically scoped Aaron was talking about, yeah.
And now you're able to, inside of other modules or classes, you can turn them on and use them.
Yeah, so it looks like that restriction has been lifted. I have not personally played with it or tried it, but that's...
But isn't it still lexical? I mean, in the sense of it's active from, like, where the module opens to where the module end is?
Yeah, so it's all lexically scoped.
Yeah, I guess you're right, because you have to be inside.
In 2.0, they limited the impact of the feature by saying you could only apply refinements at the top level. Now you can do it. But
it's lexical in the sense that the module keyword introduces a lexical scope.
Yes, exactly.
So you're right, and it's not like if I reopen that module somewhere else, I won't get those refinements unless I also include the refinement.
And if you include the module somewhere else, you're not going to get the refinements.
Okay, which is a fair point. So most of my fears seem unfounded. That's good.
Yeah, it's pretty isolated.
Okay, and that was our sidetrack on refinements. Although, to put it back on point, I will point this out. One of the dangers of this highly technical book, obviously, is that parts of it will get out of date very fast. And that's happened in a couple of areas. I noticed two. One was the refinements. It didn't really talk about the differences between Ruby 2.0 and 2.1. Another is when you talk about method caches.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Those also took a pretty big change in Ruby 2.1.
It was ironic. As soon as I finished the book, I was literally being printed somewhere. I met James Golick at a conference, and he started telling me all about the amazing stuff that he's done with, I think he and some others, Charlie Somerville, on method caching and speeding that up. And now it's scoped by class or subclass. It's a much more efficient way of doing it. And that just wasn't in Ruby when I was writing that part of the book. So I had to tell him, dude, I'm sorry I didn't cover that. But so I just touch on the basic way method caching works, but I didn't get into the really important optimizations that were made, just recently. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong. So the way it used to work is if you ever added a new method or created a new class or module, the method cache was invalidated, and
there were like 15 different things you could do to invalidate the method cache.
Right. Yeah,
so
and it would invalidate globally. Yeah.
Yeah. Now it's only invalidated for the class that you're changing.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's basically hierarchically scoped now. So, if you do it, only that branch of the tree and down needs to rebuild their method cache. So.
Right, and they made some important changes to like the R class structure to make that possible, I think. But I just didn't see that and didn't know about that when I was covering that part of it.
I really like that change because that global invalidation of the method cache was always a big penalty for using Ruby dynamically.
Yes.
Ruby is a very dynamic language, and it cries out to be used dynamically, and so I really like the change that James made, because it rewards us, for our ability to use it dynamically, or at least doesn't penalize us as much,
And I like the philosophy behind the change as well. I mean, I was asking Mats about this when I got a chance to meet him, talking about the argument, that I've participated in and seen, where it's like, on the one side, it's, we should use all these abilities of Ruby to the max, and our use should put pressure on implementers to optimize it. And the other side saying we should not use, we should constrain what features we use because some of them just aren't fast. And I was asking about that specifically with regard to method cache, things that blow up the method cache, like extend. And basically he said, you should use the features that Ruby gives you. They're there to be used, and the implementers are there to make them fast.
Yeah, totally. And some of these features are like creating methods. I mean, that's hard not to use, right?
Yeah. And then he brought up exactly this change that we're talking about, where, at that point, it wasn't released yet, but it was already in core, in the trunk, that the method caches had been broken up.
Yeah. So this is great work. And James Golick has some blog posts on that stuff, or conference presentations. So maybe we can link to those later.
Also, I guess this is the same strategy that JRuby uses, or you actually used for a while. Now MRI uses the same expiry strategy that JRuby uses.
Yeah, James was telling me that I think Charlie Nutter helped him out a lot on just, how to do this, what's the right design.
And I think some of that actually came out of the refinements discussion, because one of the issues with refinements was how expensive it was. And a lot of the examination of the refinements feature led them to some understanding that let them optimize. So, anyway. Hey, so more about the book. There's some really cool stuff in the book that talks about like the format of the R object structure and the polymorphic nature of it and how it gets used in different ways. And I guess in the C side of things, you would call it a union.
Right, yeah.
And it was great because at the beginning of the book, it looked pretty straightforward. And as you went through the book and kept talking about new kinds of objects, you talk about strings and talk about blocks and all that, we got to see how some of the quirks of Ruby get explained by that. And so there's things like why short strings are so much more efficient to use. And then there's that like 27 characters or something limit. What was it, 27?
Yeah. That was my most infamous blog post. I wrote that as a joke. Not as a joke, but I wrote the title. It was called Never Create Strings Longer Than 23 Characters.
Oh, 23, yeah.
And I thought it would be obviously tongue-in-cheek sort of a sarcastic title. And I think a lot of people took that seriously. And, they started rewriting their apps or something. I don't know. But
I've programmed that way ever since. Yeah.
Exactly.
So there was that, but there was also the thing about the compact hashes, where if there's...
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, it's like if there's few enough entries in the hash, then it just makes a little array. Stores all the values and keys right there, and you don't need to have all of the other objects allocated.
That was really interesting.
Yeah.
So
the hash chapter in general is on my list as one of the parts I thought was super cool in the whole book.
Yeah, so a lot of things here. One point I want to make is, again, the Ruby core team has done a lot of work over many years to make Ruby faster and better. And these are just some examples of the lengths that they go to. I mean, they're making the Ruby C code is very complex and hard to understand, often because of these kinds of optimizations. And they do that to speed things up and to make our apps faster. So, kudos to them, and thanks to all the hard work from Mats and Koichi and Aaron and all those guys, because, they're really helping us out. The other point I want to make is, back to hashes. You just mentioned that, James. I think another thing I want people to get out of this book is some touch on or some taste of computer science, of the computer science behind Ruby and behind the way Ruby works. And we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Everything that Ruby does is based on work and research that was done, not in the 1990s, but 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s. So, and hash tables are just one example of that. And the way I think of it is, I think most Ruby developers, maybe more so than other language communities, but a lot of Ruby developers aren't computer science majors, didn't go to college to study computer science. They might have majored in English, or they were, musicians, or they were, maybe like I didn't major in computer science either, but I got into this from some other path. So you may never have learned the theory behind hash tables or garbage collection or, how parsers and compilers work. And so I think, one reason to study how Ruby works and one reason to read this book is just to get a taste of the computer science theory behind everything that we're doing. And I think it's important. It's important not that you know every single detail and every single C, pointer and structure inside of Ruby, but you should know what a hash table is and how it works and the basic idea behind it. And, you should know what garbage collection is and what it means, at least at a conceptual level. And I think that's really my biggest, aside from storytelling and entertainment, my biggest goal of the book is really to, at a high level, at a conceptual level, just to show people with a lot of diagrams and a lot of words how the computer science inside of Ruby really works.
How much of that computer science stuff did you know before going into this, and how much did you learn along the way?
Oh, I think I learned almost all of it along the way. I mean, I was thinking about that recently. Like, I might have had a vague idea of what a hash table was. You put it in, you get it out with a key, and somehow there's something called a hash function. But I didn't really know. And so I think that's what was super exciting for me about writing this book and about doing the research behind it, was finding out. And again, It's open source software. Ruby it's all out there. You can just go read it and find out for yourself. So it was super exciting to really walk through, like, when I save a key and a value in a hash, what actually happens? When I create an object or I set an instance variable, what is Ruby really doing? And it was super fun to see just the nuts and bolts of what was going on inside, but also to get a sense of the theory underlying or underpinning that. It was really interesting.
So the hash table sticks out, or the hash chapter sticks out as such a cool example, because it's like you say, you talk about this algorithm, you talk about how it works, how items get sorted into buckets, and why that hash function is so important. And then you're like, wow, so we've learned all this. Let's see if we can break the hash, and just return a terrible hash value, and what happens to performance, and you play with it and do the experiment, and it's like, look, Ruby falls off a cliff.
Right. That was a fun one. Yeah, I remember that. It was one of the first experiments I did. And again, it points out how important, like, this tiny little detail in Ruby, like there's actually this wacky bit of C code that Mats and the team got from, I think it was the University of Berkeley or someplace, that does the hash function. And no, that's the hash table code generally. There's actually a newer algorithm they're using for the hash function called the murmur hash or something. So one little tiny detail like that has just an enormous impact on how hashes work. And hashes are underlying, that we use hashes every day in all of our code. So
yeah. So Pat, speaking of hashes, so there was actually part of the book that I found horrifying. No, not because of the book, but because of what it was explaining. And that was the section where you're talking about keyword arguments, section 4.2, or experiment 4.2, keyword arguments. And you showed how you could monkey patch the hash class and essentially break the entire language.
But how is that new?
So what's new?
You can monkey patch plus.
Well, okay, so from a VM implementer perspective, I'm used to there being like a kernel VM, and what goes on inside that kernel is can only be affected by changes within that kernel, and then you build the rest of the language on top of that. And that's much the way that Rubinius is built and JRuby and all. But MRI, apparently you can go in and you can change methods in the hash class in Ruby, and that changes the functionality of the inner workings of the VM.
Because Ruby is using hashes internally. I too was surprised by that when you showed how by constructing these keywords arguments, it was making this hidden hash, and then it was asking it if it had these keys or whatever. It was like, wow, that is kind of crazy, but neat too.
Well, yes. you can do tons of stuff to break the language, though. It's just that's not, like, that particular behavior. I don't think it's not required. Like, for example, JRuby doesn't have to implement keyword arguments that way.
I'm not encouraging people to break the language. This is not what I want.
Oh, it's too late
That's
now.
my job.
Except as an experiment.
Yeah, it's too late now.
It's a quote unquote experiment. But yeah,
I recommend everyone override the .hash function on object.
And see what happens.
So the
Always
message
return
is
1.
read Ruby under a microscope to learn what you should not do in your application.
You talked about, just digging in and actually watching Ruby do its thing and seeing what it actually does under the covers. One of the things that I found most interesting about this book was seeing you use some tools that maybe not everyone is familiar with to dig into Ruby internals. And I'm not just talking about reading the C code, but I mean more about the tools that you used to look at Ruby dynamically. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about, like, if somebody wants to get an interesting look at what's going on under the covers and like learn what Ruby can tell you about itself dynamically, what are some of the tools they should look at?
That's an interesting question. I'm actually very old-fashioned. I only primarily did 2 things. One was I used GDB, which is a C debugger, to set breakpoints and to step through the code, and in particular to look at the C stack trace, just to get a sense of where I was in time and what was happening in what order. So people, if they want to do that sort of thing, they should get the C code on their machine. They should set up the C compiler, Clang or GCC, and learn how to use GDB a little bit at least. But to be honest, the most mileage I got was by, and the most useful technique I had was very simple and very old school, which was just putting printf statements in the C code. And that was a way of, it was even more than GDB, it was a way of just giving me a sense of what happened in what order and time. And that's one of the most confusing things to figure out is, not only is there a lot of code that's hard to understand, but it's very hard to figure out what happens first and second and third and, what calls what. So I know there's better, maybe there's more sophisticated tools out there. I know there's dtrace, and Aaron, maybe you can mention that if you want. I know you did some stuff with that last year. But for me, printf was, it was a very sort of simple way, just adding a print statement here, recompiling Ruby, and running some test Ruby code and seeing, what was outputted.
But you also did some interesting things with dumping out disassembled YARV bytecode and also some stuff with object space as well.
I agree, yeah.
Yes, you're right. I'm sorry. So yes, the thing in the beginning in chapters 1 and 2 when I talk about Ripper, which helps us understand tokenization and parsing, that was really helpful. Yeah, the disassembly, that was a huge thing. So I think it's chapter 3. I get into that, chapters 2 and 3. And yeah, that was a hugely helpful thing because you really do see that language that Ruby is compiled into. And for people who didn't know that, and that was one of the things that really shocked me. I had no idea that Ruby had a compiler. That, I always thought Ruby is an interpreted language. What do you mean there's a compiler? This isn't Java. What compiler? And, but yeah, there's a compiler running in there. It produces bytecode just sort of like Java does. And, it was fascinating to learn how all that stuff worked and to see, yeah, that was another very useful tool, was just to see the bytecode that was generated for particular Ruby scripts or method calls, whatever.
If I were going to pause this podcast and go play with Ruby disassembly right now, what class and method would I be looking for?
So it's called I think it's the Ruby VM.
Yeah, instruction sequence.
Yeah, so exactly. So there's a disassemble or DIS-ASM method on that class, which is Ruby VM instruction set. We can leave a link to that in the show notes, maybe. Yeah, it's very easy to use. You just take a string which contains some Ruby code, pass it into that disassemble method, and it just prints out all the internal YARV bytecode instructions. And that can help go a long way towards just understanding, how things are working under the hood.
Aaron, do you have anything to add about poking around in Ruby's internals?
So I like to read the vmcore.c file. That's awesome. Actually, what you should look at, my favorite file is, let me get you exactly the name here, insns.def. If you go check out the Ruby source, get that file, look at that file, because it's a file that contains all of Ruby's instruction sequences and descriptions of what those instruction sequences are. So when you go and disassemble some method or whatever, like if you go dump the instruction sequences for some method, you won't necessarily know what they mean, but if you go look at this file, every one of the instructions is listed in there with documentation about what it does. So you can look at that code and then read this definition file and understand what it's doing.
Yeah, I remember that was tricky to figure out in the beginning when I was getting started because it's not a .c file.
No.
And I was like grepping and searching for, well, where is this instruction defined? Like the send instruction or whatever, the get local instruction. Like, where do I find this? And eventually I found it in this .def file. So that's a great tip.
Yeah, the def file is actually parsed and turned into a C file.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and Pat talks about that in chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Using basically metaprogramming to create the instructions.
So there's actually a method, like this is not covered in the book. There's a function that lets you load instruction sequences, but it's not exposed to the public. If you do a little bit of fiddle code, I can probably give you a snippet, but it's possible to expose this function and allow you to actually load bytecode. So theoretically, you could get the bytecode for a method, manipulate the bytecode, and then load that back up.
Wow. That's kind of scary.
Yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, and one of the cool things about Rubinius is that it actually allows you, as a standard feature, to output the bytecode. So you have a real compiler, right? So you have a Ruby compiler, and it can save out bytecode that you can then later read in and run. So I don't think MRI does that, right? You can't, you can use these tricks to look at it, but you can't save the bytecode in a separate file and then run it later, like as if it were Java.
Right. I thought your treatment of Rubinius was one of the best arguments I've seen for why Rubinius is valuable. That we can, for so much of the stack, we can just go and read in simple Ruby code what this particular method does, and that really turned out to be interesting. You had some really good examples of that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I wish I had more time to write more and learn more about Rubinius and JRuby and other versions of Ruby, but it was just I did want to touch on those and show people that there are other ways of doing things and other versions of Ruby and sort of be able to compare and contrast them. But I only had enough space and time to handle just to scratch the surface of Rubinius and JRuby, but it was a lot of fun.
Speaking of Rubinius, I know that one of the challenges of working on alternate VMs, JRuby, Rubinius, has to do with the fact that MRI was developed without a formal specification, and it just sort of grew up organically, and the implementation was the specification for the language. Oh, if it runs, it runs, right? This is Ruby. So there's some stuff that you covered in the book that looked like the kind of stuff that would drive me a little crazy trying to implement or to understand why it was that way and if it really mattered. Like in chapter 6 when you were talking about modules and sharing and how all that stuff works. And it was like, well, okay, when you include a module, it shares the method table, but it doesn't share everything. So there's changes that you can make to the module that, after it's been included that will like instantly show up in all the classes that have already included that module, but there's other changes you can make that will not show up.
Right.
I got asked that question on stage once, by the way. What happens if you include a module again in the class hierarchy? I'm like, I have no idea.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think these are, for me, it's not like I'm recommending that you do these things or that this is an important feature of the language even. For me, it's important in sort of a scientific way. Like, it's a way of researching or getting to the question of, or answering the question, how does Ruby work? Like, how do modules work? What happens when you include them? And doing these wacky things. The same thing with the hash, right? Breaking the hash using a poor hash function. It's not something I'm telling you that you should do. It's sort of an experimental trick. It's a way, as a scientist, for me to, quote unquote scientist, as a way for me to figure out what's really going on the inside and prove that the theory is correct. Yeah,
I'm not knocking your approach in the book at all. But I look at these things and I'm wondering, okay, is it that way by accident or is it that way intentionally?
Oh, good question. Yeah.
And you didn't build the Ruby language, so you're not the person who can answer that question. But I love that the book shows all of these things where I now know, oh, hey, this is a thing that I would love to ask Matt the next time he sits down next to me on a plane, right? So,
Because that has happened.
yes.
Yeah, I was so lucky to meet Matt, and I gave him a copy of the book, but I didn't think of asking these tough questions. I was just like, thanks for creating Ruby. It was super, super fun to write the book. I signed a copy for him, but I should have asked him, why do you not share the method table when you include a module?
If only I'd have pinned him to the wall there. Dang it.
And I suspect a lot of that stuff is just, what you said, it just grew organically and it just is the way it is. Or, maybe there are subtle reasons for some of these design decisions.
I think it's amazing you talk about, understanding how all this works. A lot of times, we see people talk about how Ruby leaks memory. And whenever they do that, I'm just going to want them to read your chapter on blocks and closures. Because that's it. Whenever I look into the code, 9 times out of 10, they're keeping a bunch of closure references around, and
right.
You can see how that works. It copies all this memory into the heap, and it has to live for the length of that thing, and that's your leak,
That part of the book was the most fun for me, Chapter 8, and the part about how blocks and closures work. And I think it's one of the most beautiful features of the Ruby language, how you can, in this elegant way, pass in a function or a lambda to another one. And then when I was learning how Ruby worked, that was the most fun and interesting part of it. Learning how blocks are handled internally, how they're passed around. And then, how when you create a closure, how they're copied out into the heap. That was like a big moment, was like, oh, I'm getting this. I can see how Ruby works here. When you create a closure, it's put into the heap and it sort of stays there forever, and as long as you're using it. So that was one of the big aha moments for me when I was when I figured out how closures worked. And I think that's important for Ruby developers to sort of, to know that.
That explanation, I thought, was extremely valuable, in particular for the comparison or the discussion of the optimization that has gone into blocks, so that when you pass a proc into a method, it has to create the extra context. But if you call it with a block, then it can share the context of the method.
Right. And it was also one of the most difficult things to figure out was how blocks work and, how the pointers to the block structure are handled. But blocks and procs are really the same thing. And a proc is a sort of a wrapper around the block, so it can be handled like a Ruby object.
Yeah.
But it's all very confusing, but I hope I tried to explain that stuff in a way that made sense.
It was good because it helped you understand sometimes why there might be multiple syntaxes for something. Like you have block given in yield, or you can, give the extra parameter with the ampersand in front of it and get the actual proc object. And there's even been talk in the past, like, why do we need both of these? Shouldn't we just have one way to call a block? But it's like Josh said, well, when you only use yield, then Ruby kind of knows that it's only going to happen in that method, and it can take a few shortcuts, whereas if you pull it up into an object, who knows where you're going to send that object, and now it's got to start copying some memory,
Yeah, and I think blocks are definitely a special case inside of the Ruby C code, but I think that was a great decision, and it's one of the things that sets the language apart. For example, this is probably it's going to get me in trouble to say this, but Ruby and Python are very, very, very similar. They're almost like the same language, but when I compare the two, I think the fact that you can use blocks the way that you do in Ruby is one of the things that I love about Ruby that I find missing in Python. But I'm not a Python developer, so I'm sure I'm going to get hate mail from those folks about why Python is actually better than Ruby. But that was one. So my point is only that blocks are one of the most elegant features of the language. And so it was really neat to see how they work internally and how they're handled. And I think for me, that was the most fun part of the book to write.
I'm just amazed they were able to finish the language with such an important blocking feature.
Oh, no, Josh, no.
I thought Aaron was supposed to give us the puns.
Oh, I haven't had my coffee today. I can't do it.
Aaron gives us great emoji instead.
Too many blockers.
Oh, there we go.
Nice. All right, well, we've been talking for about an hour. What else do we need to cover before we move on? I have one more thing. I loved the garbage collection chapter. I thought, when you took on garbage collection, I thought, wow, this is kind of a big topic, and I was a little worried, you know? It's, you did a great job. Like, you really went pretty deep into it, you know, simple market sweep, how does that work? And then, okay, so that's not ideal. What can we go one step more? And just showed how Ruby's algorithm has evolved, you know, over time. And
Yeah.
I talked about how some other parts of the book were, you know, hadn't caught up with some of the most recent advances, but actually this part had. You mentioned the changes in 2.1 and all that, so it's just like, it was really cool. You took on this really hardcore concept in a super accessible way. It was great.
Well, thanks a lot. And that was not easy. And a lot of that, I have to thank my editor, Bill Pollack from No Starch. So he's not a developer or Rubyist. He didn't help me with garbage collection, but he helped me pull that together into something that was understandable. And it was a challenge. I was trying to finish this book in a reasonable amount of time last year, and it was just kind of dragging on and on. I couldn't, but I really wanted to get to garbage collection. I just felt it was important enough, and I couldn't leave it out. And I also thought it would be a good way to end the book. It's sort of it's like the death of a Ruby object. How do things, you get cleaned up and reused again? But it was tough pulling that into a format that made sense, and that's where Bill Pollack really helped me out. So thanks a lot to all the folks at No Starch for helping me improve this. So I did a version of Ruby under Microscope in 2012 that was just on my own. And, you know, the version I did last year, I think came out to be a lot better with some professional help. That could be a whole nother podcast for you guys, you know, self-publishing versus traditional publishing. I'm sure Abdi has a lot to say on that topic, but, you know, all I want to say is I got the best of both worlds. I was able to write my own ebook one year and then the next year do it with professionals. And anyway, back to garbage collection. Yeah, that was a tough topic, and he helped me really just sort of scope it, shape it in a way that was, that made sense.
Yeah, Pat, I got a question about some of the terminology in that chapter. So you talked about like young objects and mature objects and the Eden. You talked about Eden as the place where objects were born. When all this stuff, like generational garbage collection, when that was being developed, I guess in the 80s, 90s, I guess it was the 80s. We called those things.
It was actually earlier. It was like 60s and 70s, probably.
So probably in research, I think I remember it was like becoming available in commercial implementations in the 80s.
Right.
And, you know, I would go to the UPSLA conferences and people would be doing papers on generational garbage collection. But they would talk about the place where objects were born was called the nursery. And then they would move through several generations. And then they would, you know, when they got to the point where you stopped doing the copying and you started doing the mark sweep, you know, the mature objects, they called that tenure.
Right.
So you can tell this stuff came from academics.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, that's maybe a good thing to point out there. It seemed like, Pat, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seemed like, for the most part, Pat tried to use the terminology that you would see if you were digging inside of the Ruby source.
Yes, exactly. Yes. That's a great point. I should have said that earlier. Yeah, there were a lot of times, not just with garbage collection, but in many other parts of the book where I didn't really know. Another example is it a meta class, a singleton class, an eigen class? You know, there's this whole other, not a debate, but, you know, different people use different words for that. And I tried not to sort of impose any opinion on that. I try to use the words that Mats and the core team used in the code. So same thing with garbage collection. Although a lot of that stuff in that chapter is not about MRI, it's about Rubinius and JRuby. Right. But I would just use the words that I would see in the code. Exactly.
Okay. So that makes total sense then. And I had that impression as well.
So, and again, Aaron, you got some great suggestions on garbage collection for, you know, I think you helped me add a whole nother piece to one of the experiments. And so you had some great contributions there. Thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, of course. No problem. It's my pleasure.
What about the forward? I mean, can we get somebody good for the forward?
That was really awesome, Aaron. Thanks again. I don't know how to...
No problem. I was happy to do it.
Yeah, it's a pro tip. If you're going to write a book about Ruby, get Aaron Patterson to review it and write a foreword for you.
All right, let's do some picks. Josh, you wanted to go first.
Yes. Yeah, just time and all that. Okay, so I'm being lazy about picks right now. Probably all heard of these by now, but just for the record, xkcd.com/now is like the best world clock I've ever seen. So go check that out.
It is awesome.
And then, the new thing, atom.io, the Atom editor from GitHub. I've played with it for a whole hour now, and it looks pretty cool. I think it has a lot of potential. It's basically, people have compared it to Sublime Text in its functionality and sort of feel, but it's built mainly in CoffeeScript, and it uses CSS for all the styling and theming, so it's meant to be extremely hackable. And the thing that I've noticed in that hour or so of playing around with it is that it seems like the kind of thing that I would build. It's like the people who build it think a lot like I do. So there haven't been much surprises. It's been everything's made a lot of sense to me. So I'm looking forward to playing around with that more. And that's it for me.
Avdi, do you have some picks?
Well, I got one. So you know how Google has this thing where they come up with really neat technology and then they just completely fail to market it well? So for a long time, they've had a feature where if you've got an Android phone, I don't know if you can do this on an iPhone. Maybe you can. But if you've got an Android phone and if you've got Google+, you can have the phone automatically sync your photos straight up to the Google+ private photo gallery. And this is not terribly unusual. I think Facebook has copied them since then. So you can have your stuff synced to Facebook immediately. And it's a nice little backup in case you dump your phone in the lake. And it's also convenient because, like, once you go to your computer and you want to, like, post some photos from your trip or something, the photos are just, like, right there in the cloud. So it does that. It's very nice, but that's not super unusual. They've also been incorporating some really nice photo editing capabilities into it, into the online web app. And that's cool too, but again, not super unusual, but worth checking out. What's really interesting is that, several months ago, they rolled out something that they call Auto Awesome, which is like the worst name ever because it's meaningless. But at a base level, what it means is whenever my stuff gets synced to Google Plus Photos, it saves the original copy of the photos, but then it also runs some automatic enhancement on them. So stuff like if a picture is washed out, it'll punch up the color a bit. If a picture has some blurriness, it'll sharpen it a little bit. Particularly if there's an area that was so bright that it just completely washed out, or if there's an area is super deep in shadow, it'll touch up just those areas to bring out the detail that you couldn't see before. A lot of little tweaks that are just barely noticeable, but unless you flip flop between the original and the enhanced version, but it works really well. I can't think of an instance yet where I've preferred the original to the enhanced version. It's all very subtle. And it's a bajillion times nicer than than going in manually and fiddling with stuff in the photo editor to try to punch up a photo a little bit. So it's really, really nice. And that just happens automatically. And it's gotten to the point where I just wait until a photo gets synced up and gets auto awesomed before I post it anywhere because I know that version will be nicer. But then they've gone a step beyond that too, where they'll take some of your photos and just do random awesome stuff to them. And it's not destructive. I mean, you've still got the originals, but it'll take, if you take a sequence of photos and fast, right after each other of something that's in motion, it'll just automatically make a GIF for you, of the action happening. Or, sometimes it does little collages. Lately, it has taken to noting that a series of photos was from a particular outing or something, and just putting the photos and videos all together with some musical backdrop and making it a little 30-second video of that outing. And it just pops those into your collection they weren't there before, and then they just appear there. It's hey, you've got some new stuff here. And often it's actually, like they say, kind of awesome. So yeah, it's the coolest thing online that nobody's talking about. And it's totally worth playing around with Google Plus just for their photo stuff. And that was really long, so I'll just end it at that.
The Auto Awesome feature was clearly programmed by passionate ninja rock stars, I think. The naming. You can tell by the naming. I also feel compelled to point out that Avdi just said GIF, and last week I said GIF, which I've been taking flack for.
Do we have to fight now?
I know, right? Just to be clear though, I prefer the way Avdi said it. I only said it the other way because I thought that had been definitively proven correct. So.
Well, if you're a freedom fighter, CompuServe defined the word and said it was pronounced GIF, and then they were jerks and exerted IP control and tried to break the internet. So I'm all for pronouncing it GIF.
Yeah, so stick it to the man.
So now we get to change it. All right, there you go. There's the Ruby Rogues take. We are saying GIF in order to fight the power. That's it.
GIF.
Right there.
GIF.
Yeah, jeez, yeah, I blow it. Nice. Okay, Aaron, save me from this conversation. Your picks, please.
Yeah, I've got a lot of picks. I usually post them to my Instagram and also Twitter, so check them out there. That's usually my cat. Man, I don't know. Let's see. What's on my desk? I have a Ruby Under the Microscope book. That is my pick for the week.
We should do that as a book club sometime.
No, man, I don't know. I guess I choose SparkFun.com because I'm spending a lot of money there lately for some reason. Go to SparkFun.com. You can make robots and stuff, which is what I am doing.
That's amazing.
Well, okay, I'll tell you what I'm doing. I am extremely jealous. Okay, I'm working on a system to identify my magic cards, and I'm extremely jealous of my friend's robotic system made out of Legos, but I don't want to spend the money on Legos, so now I'm trying to build a robot without them. So wow. That is what I'm doing.
So many emotions wrapped up in that. Envy and...
Yes. Joy, envy, trial, tears.
That's great. Alright. Is that all your picks?
That's all my picks.
Okay. I've got a few. First, I've been doing a lot of work with hypermedia lately, which basically means that I've made all the mistakes you can make when implementing your own hypermedia API now, and so I appreciate them. So there's this thing I've seen on GitHub called .json, which is another hypermedia format, kind of like collection.json or HAL, but it talks about some of the flaws with those and why they're trying to build a new format and stuff. So that's of interest to me. If you work with hypermedia formats, it might be of interest to you too. Then I saw a good blog post from Envy Labs about not every object being an active record object, not every model being an active record model. And I think that's one of the killer things, I have known for a long time and I see people struggle with still. Once they get in the Rails mindset and they have that app models folder, they think that everything in there has to be active record, and it's incredibly powerful to just remember that you can be able to insert a class that's, just a normal class. And this blog post talks about that. And then the third thing, just for amazing fun, I was talking with a coworker, Jared Ning, the other day, who's house hunting, and we got to talking about building our own houses. And he dropped this link on me of 33 amazing ideas for basically inside your house. And they are absolutely amazing. They made me want to build my own house right now using all 33 of these ideas, and a billion more. It's super cool. You gotta go check it out. Those are my picks. Pat, what do you have for us?
Real quick, before I get to the picks, I just wanted a couple shout outs. Just thank, Peter Cooper for all his support, and he's just encouraged me for so long and helped me have enough confidence to write this book. And also Xavier Noria from Barcelona was my technical reviewer in 2012 when I self-published it. And so thanks so much for your help. And of course, Aaron, thanks for all the work you did last year. So for my picks, I have an article. Actually, I wanted to pick one of my own articles, which sounds really egotistical and selfish, but and I know you guys are going to do an episode on Jim, but I was really saddened by Jim Weirich's passing, and I was just looking back, happy that I had a chance to interview him. So I wanted to put in a link to an interview I did with Jim Weirich back in 2012. And it was really, I read it again today, and it was a fun conversation. We talked about, the job description of a computer programmer. That was really interesting. And I called him a technical storyteller, which I think is a great way of describing Jim, at least one side of his personality. And actually in that interview, we talked about an article by Michael Feathers. I'll give you that link in a moment, as well. It's called 10 Papers Every Programmer Should Read, or something like that. And it's a really, fascinating list of articles, academic articles from a long time ago. And back to the point with my book, which is I wanted to encourage Ruby developers to learn something about computer science and learn about how Ruby works. So this is a great way of, Michael Feathers has a great list of old academic articles that you can go read that are really fascinating. So I'll give you that link. And then on the same topic, a friend of mine, Mike Bernstein from New York, who works at Code Climate, is also famous for reading academic articles, and he tweets them quite often. So follow him on Twitter, MRB_BK. And he also did a fascinating presentation called Distributed Systems Archaeology or something like that. So check that out, where he goes through, the history of academic research and talks about a lot of amazing academic papers that, again, you can read. So I'll give you guys these links. A lot of great things you can go read up on about computer science. But that's it. Thanks. And thanks, guys, for having me on today. Really it was a blast. A lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you very much for writing the book and then coming to talk to us. Our next book club book, we are going to do Object Design by Rebecca Werfsbrock and Alan McKean. So we're going to get in touch with them and see when we can get them on the show. But the full title is Object Design, Roles, Responsibilities, and Collaboration. So it sounds awesome. I think we've been told it was one of the inspirations for Pooter, so which we all loved. So that's the book we're working on next. Go ahead and grab a copy and read along with us. And I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time.